Hello, and welcome to part 5 of the Hockey Basics series. I'm Mario in Black, and today I'm going to give an overview of all the penalties and then dive deeper on 6 of the most common physical penalties. So let's get right to it. Here's a list of the vast majority of all penalties. I did not include things like coaches stepping on the ice or other incredibly rare penalties that you never see, but they're still in the rule book. There's a lot here. I'm not going to break them all down. In fact, I'm going to highlight the ones that I'll break down over the next 2 weeks. So you can see here the ones that are highlighted. These will be broken apart into physical penalties and all other penalties. I'm going to go over 6 of the physical penalties this week, but at the very end, when I've done the physical penalties and all the others next week, I'll do a lightning round of the ones that are not highlighted here, just to give you an idea of what they are. So here are the most common physical penalties. They're boarding, body checking, cross-checking, interference, goalie interference, and roughing. The commonality with all of these, and I'm going to go through every slide, is that these can all be minor penalties, major penalties, match penalties, but let's get down to the examples of each specific penalty. Let's start with boarding. I'm going to have the key rule written down for each of these. You can find everything in the rule book, and I'll link it in the description below, but I wanted to highlight the key rule that I'm pulling from for a lot of my description. The key term to know for boarding is violently hitting a defenseless player into the boards. You'll commonly see this as a hit from behind, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. If a player is in a position they can't defend themselves and they are thrust into the boards, it can then be called boarding. Boarding is most often a minor penalty, but can escalate to a major. A big factor in escalating it to a major is if a player has had enough time to lay off the hit, but chose not to. Sometimes a player will begin to engage the hit, and their opponent will quickly maneuver in such a way that puts them in that vulnerable position. These are typically called minors, but if a player has had time to react and does not lay off the hit, it can be escalated to a major. If called a major and there's a head or face injury, then it's automatically a game misconduct as well. Boarding can result in fines and suspensions for more severe offenses. These are more likely to be handed out if a player has a history of disciplinary actions. All right, moving on to the example, and I'm going to play this a few times. So here's the first play. The Ottawa player here in white will get thrown into the boards by the Boston player in green. So stop, and I'll play it again. So the Ottawa player is deemed to be in a defenseless position, and they're violently thrust into the boards. This was called boarding in the action. I'll play it one more time. Just look out for the Ottawa player, how they're kind of bent over and in that vulnerable position, and the Boston player engages in the hit and throws them into the boards in a dangerous manner. So here, and the check happens, and it's a violent thrust that could lead to injury. Luckily in this case, there was no injury on the play. Now on to the rule that probably has the most variance, body checking. It has so much variance, the rulebook frequently goes back and forth between putting a space between body and checking and just making body checking all of one word. The second paragraph of the rule is pasted here and is the key on what is considered a body check. The common way it's called is when a player throws a check and hits someone moving in the opposite direction from them. This also has applied historically when puck carriers are kind of stationary or moving at a slow speed and the other player comes in and makes hard contact. One of the keys here is if a player comes in and makes a hit, but that hit is in an effort for them to play the puck, like if they bump somebody off as they're trying to play the puck, they will not call body checking in those cases. It's only for hits when the player kind of runs through them, no intent to play the puck. They're clearly just trying to make the hit. Checking in the PWHL is in a bit of a middle ground from other women's hockey leagues and from a men's league like the NHL. Historically in women's leagues, any sort of body check where the intent is to hit the opponent is called. In the NHL, all body checking is legal so long as it doesn't also break another rule. In the PWHL, checking is allowed in some circumstances, but not in circumstances where the opposite direction force, as I've mentioned earlier, is applied. It's pretty common to see a defender ride the puck carrier into the boards by leaning on them until they hit the wall. This is legal when the players are moving in the same direction and, the defending player just kind of eases the other player into the boards, even if it's violent contact, it's still considered a legal check. Another legal hit is if somebody moves into a player and that player holds their ground. When someone tries to hit or shove the puck carrier out of the way and the puck carrier throws a hit back, it's often called a reverse hit. When the puck carrier moves into the defender and the defender hits them while they're holding their position, it's often called a stand-up check. While these exceptions are legal as body checks, they can still be called penalties if another rule, like checking to the head, happens during the course of the action. I believe it's one of the toughest rules to enforce for officials, since the line on what's illegal and what's legal can be pretty blurry. The idea of the rule is to allow for more contact, but to not allow the wipeout style checks that you see in leagues like the NHL, because those are very dangerous hits. The example I'll show is a pretty clear-cut one, but there's a lot that can live on that line between penalty and no penalty. As with boarding, these can be anywhere between a minor penalty and a match penalty, depending on the severity. In the case of body checking, if it's considered a major penalty, then it automatically comes with a game misconduct no matter what. Given that these are violent plays like boarding, fines and suspensions may occur for more severe incidents. And now on to the example. So I'm going to show this the first time, and you'll see the Boston player in white and the Seattle player in green kind of come into each other. Let me play it again. So the Boston player is in white and the Seattle player kind of comes in and has that opposite direction contact. One of the keys is the Seattle player is not attempting to play the puck. They're just attempting to hit, and they come in at a pretty good rate of speed and knock them off the puck. So this was considered a body check by the referees. As with all of these replays, nobody got hurt on any of these. I wouldn't show a video like that, but this kind of shows that opposite directional force on the hit. And, it can be a dangerous play just given how fast the players are moving on the ice. Next up, I'd like to talk about cross-checking. Cross-checking is technically a stick infraction, but it falls better with the penalties I'm listing today due to the potential violence of it. The rule is pretty succinct in this case. You often see this when a player has their hands separated on their stick with the stick in a horizontal position parallel to the ice. Then the player thrusts the stick into their opponent. If a player is laying their stick on the opponent and then pushes, this is often considered a legal shove. But if there's space between the stick when the player thrusts it in their opponent, then cross-checking can and often is called. Cross-checking is similar to body checking in that a major automatically comes with a game misconduct. And as with everything on this list today, cross-checking can lead to supplementary discipline more often if there's a history of, major penalties or game misconducts from a player. So as with the others, I'll play this video a few times. Seattle's in kind of the green tealish here, and Montreal's in the beige, lighter color uniform. But you'll see the Seattle player comes up and kind of thrusts their stick into the back of the Montreal player. And then the Montreal player goes down. So I'll play it for you again. You see the stick is kind of horizontal and they thrust it into the player. It's not, if the player had the stick on their back and then kind of pushed a little bit, it may have been good. But as you'll see, there's kind of that thrusting motion where they thrust it into the back and then it causes the player to go down. And this was called a cross check in this case. Interference is a fairly broad rule with 8 different definitions of it, but almost all of the called interference penalties are due to a player not in possession of the puck, impeding an opponent who also doesn't have possession of the puck as well. There's a bit of a grace period for interference. If a player has just gotten rid of the puck, then if they're contacted kind of directly after, interference won't be called. It'll only be called if enough time has passed at the referee's discretion that it should be called interference. This often happens when the puck is dumped in by the attacking team. The defender may come up and engage the attacker. If the attacker has just gotten rid of the puck, then the defender has kind of a small window where they can engage and make contact and impede the defender, as they're still kind of considered the puck carrier. But if too much time has passed, then the defender could be called for interference in this case. A defender is entitled to their space and are allowed to get in the way of another player and force them to go around them, so long as the other player is aware of that defender. There is a specific rule about pick plays, which is the exception to this. A pick play is when a player deliberately moves into the space of another player and the other player runs into them and is unaware that that player kind of came in and took up that space. This happens often when a team is attacking and they try to get a pick off a defender by having the puck carrier maneuver around their teammate, and that teammate gets in the way of the defender, which kind of frees up the puck carrier in this case. Players do get pretty sly with this and will try to put themselves in a position where they're running a pick style of play, but it looks natural and not like they're getting intentionally in the way of the other player. Officials don't call incidental contact plays where both players are unaware and they kind of run into each other. So players can try to get around this, but if it becomes too obvious, then it'll be called interference. As with all the penalties I'm discussing today, this can be elevated to a major or match penalty. If it is a major penalty and there's an injury to an opponent, then it's automatically a game misconduct as well. A vast majority of interference penalties are minors, but if, say, a player targeted somebody without the puck and ran them over, they could get a major and face supplementary discipline. It's pretty uncommon to see this for interference, and usually there's other factors involved as well. One last note before I move on. While interference is often, the body-to-body contact, sometimes it can be called in other circumstances. I said there was 8 definitions of it earlier. If there's a stick or other equipment on the ice, you can't shoot that item toward, the puck carrier or toward a player that may cause them to be tripped up by the item. If you do this, then it'll be called interference. Also, say if there's a stick on the ice and the player that dropped it is trying to pick it back up and the opponent goes and whacks the stick away so they can't pick it up, then that can be called interference as well. All right, now on to the example. So in this case, Ottawa's in red, Montreal's in the beige, and this is going to be considered interference. And it's kind of like that example I talked about earlier where the puck carrier is dumping the puck into the zone and then enough time has passed before they're engaged with. And one of the big things in this case that kind of worked against the player that committed the interference, as I'll show it to you again, luckily this has a few different angles of the replay, is that the player kind of goes out of their way to cut off the Ottawa player's path in this case. Had they kind of stood their ground a little bit and the Ottawa player had ran into them, it probably would have been good. But the Ottawa player is trying to maneuver around, and the Montreal player basically makes themselves bigger and kind of goes out of their way to knock the Ottawa player down. So in this case, it's a pretty clear-cut interference based on how the rule's been called historically. So yeah, you can see the Montreal player kind of going out of their way, getting that arm out and, impeding the progress of the Ottawa player. All right, very similar to interference is goalie interference. It tends to be everyone's favorite rule when it comes to goals being allowed or disallowed. I'm not going to be going over that in this, but I will talk about it when it becomes a penalty in this case. Goalie interference, to put it bluntly, is running into the goalie. There's incidental contact over the course of a play that may happen, but the penalty comes when the player directly runs into or falls on the goalie, whether they're inside or outside the crease. Goalie interference is not called if a player is pushed into the goalie by an opponent. You do get the referee's discretion on whether they reasonably could have gotten out of the way or not. Just because someone gave you a light push doesn't mean you get to do a full-on pratfall into the goalie. If you make it that obvious, then you're probably going to get called for the penalty. Goalie interference is called similarly to interference when it comes to escalation to majors. It's a variant of interference itself. The extra things that come with it are more in regards to the goalie being able to play their position when judging if a goal counts or not. When a penalty is called, it follows the interference standard. Before there's any supplementary discipline, if you run into someone else's goalie, the initial discipline is you'll have 5 opponents on the ice greeting you quite aggressively. Don't run into the opponent's goalie if you can. It's generally not going to work out too well for you, and you're going to get a lot of shoves and pushes and people saying not very nice things to you. All right, here's an example. I don't have the replay, so it's from the live feed. Montreal is in the red here, and then Boston is in the white. So you'll want to look at the goalie crease as the player kind of falls into the goalie. So it'll happen right here. Player kind of just runs straight into the goalie. In this case, they were not pushed. Look out for the player again. You'll see they're not pushed. They kind of just run straight into the crease and hit the goalie and knock the goalie over. This was called a penalty on the play. I'll play it for you one more time. And I want to highlight that the Boston player in this case was probably not intentionally trying to run in the goalie. However, they did end up in the crease. And when you end up in the crease, that's kind of the goalie's territory. So if you run into the goalie and you go into the crease on your own, you're taking that into your own hands and you're at risk for being called for the penalty. So I'll show it to one more time. Boston player comes in and runs into the goalie, and then this ends up being called a minor for goalie interference. And if I had played this further, you'd see the Montreal player that's right on top of the Boston player, ends up kind of giving her a bit of a shove and, telling her that she's not too appreciative of that. All right, the last penalty I'm going to go over today. Roughing often comes about when somebody throws a punch and it hits the opponent in the head. These are often seen in scuffles when things get heated and someone takes a shot. Roughing is often called on a player of each team when they're both throwing shots at each other. Roughing is not fighting. Fighting is the whole operation of taking the gloves off and squaring up with an opponent. Roughing is usually one or two quick punches in the middle of a scuffle. Roughing can happen over the course of a play as well if somebody gives somebody else a shot and kind of gets them in the head, if they're fighting for the puck as an example. Roughing is most often a minor penalty. It can be escalated, but usually something else would be called in those circumstances, like something else happened and then kind of, like a big boarding penalty, and then everybody started throwing shots at each other because of it. Somebody may get hurt, and then they tack on roughing penalties on top of it. As with boarding, if a major is called and there is a head injury, then it's an automatic game misconduct. And as with everything else, fines and suspensions can be levied for more severe infractions. All right, this example, Boston in green, Ottawa in white. This will be a case where two players kind of get in a pushing and shoving match. As with the last one, it's just the broadcast view. I don't have a replay view of this. But I'll play the video here, and you'll see the two players come together. It ends up being an offside play, so the whistle's blown down, and then the two players get into a bit of a scuffle. So here, puck goes in, plays whistle down, two players on the boards, and they start pushing and shoving, pushing. Not really a big headshot here, as I said with the example of roughing, but in this case, they ended up calling roughing on both players just to kind of keep the peace. So I'll play it for you again, and you can see after the whistle, they kind of start, pushing and shoving. They're both engaging with each other. No one player is getting the worst of it. And I'll play it for you one more time. So, play is about to be whistled down. Kind of a hit into the boards as the play is whistled down, and then they tell each other how much they don't, like all the extracurriculars after the whistle. A lot of these kind of roughing penalties are kind of vibes based, for lack of a better term. Sometimes a play like this will not be called, but if the officials kind of want to set an example, or maybe they feel like the temperature of the game is getting heated, they may send both players off to kind of tell them, hey, we're kind of setting the standard here. If we see anything more like this, we'll put you in the box, and we might not necessarily put somebody else from the other team. So they, there might end up being a power play out of it. But, you'll see officials call these, matching minor roughing penalties just to try to cool things down a bit if they're getting heated. If it's a game where not much is going on and then a scuffle like this happens, then in those cases, they may lay off the roughing because, at that point, the temperature is not heated. And then maybe going forward, if those continue to happen, then they'll call roughing on each team or one team, depending on, what future circumstances look like. So that'll be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something with some of the more common physical infractions. These are the ones that can generally lead to, escalation, major penalties, that sort of thing. If, things get too out of hand. I didn't include checking to the head. It's exactly as you'd imagine. Those are kind of considered some of the more severe penalties, and a lot of them are called automatically as majors and, have to be downgraded if they're accidental or not. So I didn't want to, include those because a lot of those lead to injuries as well. And I don't want to include videos with injuries. I just don't think that's the vibe of this channel. But, next week I'll get to the other penalties I highlighted early on that are not the physical infractions. Hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave any feedback in the comments below, especially any ideas for future videos as I kind of get to a close on this iteration of the Hockey Basics series. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope everybody has a great day.